Is eating fish healthy? Certainly not for the fish. Definitely not for the oceans. That's the reason the Sarno brothers, founding chefs at Good Catch Foods, began perfecting 100% plant-based seafood. Go to goodcatchfoods.com to learn more or shop online.
Amor, ¿quieres que pase por Aldi?
Ya fui yo y traje todo para hacer una carne asada. La carne se ve muy buena y bien barata. ¡Mamá! ¡Ay, me toca ser la maestra! ¡Chao!
Porque eres más que una mamá, mereces más de tu supermercado. Por eso en Aldi tenemos la gran calidad que mereces a los precios bajos que buscas. Tenemos carne certificada por la USDA y cada día nos llega una gran selección de cortes. Para productos de calidad a precios bajos todos los días, ven primero a Aldi.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Jeffrey Epstein Show. I'm your host, Bobbycapucci, and this is a morning update. Last night we were talking about Jeffrey Epstein and tax havens, and how Jeffrey Epstein would use those sorts of tax havens to set up these shell companies, and then from those shell companies move the money around to wherever it was needed to make sure that his criminal enterprise continues to run smoothly. Well, today we have another article from the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists that talks about Jeffrey Epstein specifically and how his fortune was traced to the Paradise Papers. Now, we've talked a lot about the FinCEN files as of late here, but we're going to start moving into the Paradise Papers as well. This first article today is going to talk a little bit about Jeffrey Epstein and his fortune and how it ties into the Paradise Papers. But some of the other articles we're going to go over in the next few days are going to give you an overview about the Paradise Papers, and then we'll talk about how that ties in to our case overall. But this article this morning is a good way to dip our toes into it, right? You know, look, Jeffrey Epstein was obviously engaging in a supreme amount of financial fraud. And he was not the only one, obviously. What the Paradise Papers, what the Panama Papers, what the FinCEN files, what they have all shown us is a real long look behind the curtain at what these people do and how they conduct themselves. And I'm just speaking about financially. Never mind the draconian way they conduct themselves privately. We've seen plenty of that as well. But from just the financial aspect, it is very apparent that Jeffrey Epstein and his criminal enterprise was fully engaged in an epic amount of money laundering and financial fraud. Like I said, this article is from the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. The author of this article is Spencer Woodman. Headline: Jeffrey Epstein's offshore fortune traced to Paradise Papers. Fresh revelations from ICIJ investigations raise the likelihood that sex offender Jeffrey Epstein cloaked his fortune in a series of offshore shell companies registered in notoriously secretive tax havens. Now, you see how it's all tying in here, right? Yesterday we talked about those tax havens, and now this morning we're diving right back in and talking about how Jeffrey Epstein's companies were set up in these places that are considered tax havens. And it was all done with a purpose, right? Nothing Jeffrey Epstein ever did was just off the cuff. The man was a lot of things, but they surely had a plan, and they stuck to their plan, and they were successful with their criminal behavior for decades. And Jeffrey Epstein, Darren Indyke, Ghislaine Maxwell, their fingerprints are all over these shell companies. Their fingerprints are all over these financial crimes. The question is, are the authorities going to make them pay? Because we have seen time and time again, these people that inhabit the financial sector, these people that are bankers, these people that are huge businessmen or businesswomen, they always find a way to skate out of trouble. But if they really are going after Jeffrey Epstein and they're really going to hit his finances hard, I don't see an out for these people this time around. Because it's quite obvious that at the very least, Indike and Khan have intimate knowledge of all of these financial transactions, especially Indike, considering his signature is all over this stuff. And this was right in his wheelhouse, what he was supposed to do. So, again, how are Khan and Indike still executors of the estate? They need to be prosecuted, in my opinion, and prosecuted hard. Because Indike and Khan, even if they weren't involved in the actual abuse of the girls, were key factors in setting up the financial portion of this and making sure that it went off without a hitch. So, when we talk about these offshore companies and we talk about these shell companies and we talk about money laundering, there is no doubt in my mind that Darren Indike should be wrapped up in this and should definitely be facing the heat. Now, Denise George is turning up the heat a bit on them down there in the Virgin Islands, but I'd really like to see the SDNY get their shit together and really start going hard here too. This article was published on July 18th of 2019. Fresh revelations raise the likelihood that sex offender Jeffrey Epstein cloaked his fortune in a series of offshore shell companies registered in notoriously secretive tax havens. Yeah, there's no doubt. I mean, even all the way back then, if we go back to July of 2019, right after his arrest, etc., it was obvious that Epstein was engaging in some financial scumbaggery, right? Just a cursory glance of what he was up to could tell you that there was a reason he was based down in the Virgin Islands. There was a reason all of these shell companies were put together. And there was a reason that Jeffrey Epstein and his associates tried to keep it all secret. So that was very apparent from the very beginning. What wasn't so apparent was how deep all of these ties ran and just how many connections and how many relationships, professional and otherwise, Jeffrey Epstein had with some of the most powerful people in the world. We're talking presidents, business magnates, we're talking you name it. And these are the kind of people that Jeffrey Epstein had in his pocket. The wealthy financier, pedophile, accused of systematically assaulting and trafficking numerous underage girls, tried this week to convince a federal judge in New York to allow him to go free on bail, partially by detailing his fortune for the court. Well, we all know how that turned out, right? We know that the court wasn't having it. We know that the court knew that Epstein was a flight risk, and the court knew that Epstein had much more money than he was letting on. At the very least, the prosecutors suspected it. So, Jeffrey Epstein, his plan was to detail all of this great amount of wealth that he has, and then use that wealth once again as a way for him to avoid being in jail while he awaited trial, right? He'd put up all these properties and this, that, the other thing, and say, well, I'm putting up all of these millions of dollars. I'm not going to run anywhere. And more times than not, that shit, it works, right? But it didn't work in this case. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that the court wasn't really sure how much money Jeffrey Epstein really had. This guy has money buried in treasure chests all over the place, would be my guess. Folks, I can't stress this enough. The amount of fraudulent financial transactions that were taking place with Jeffrey Epstein is absurdly high. And all of those people that were receiving money from him or sending him money are all now part of the criminal conspiracy, if this case is pursued the correct way. This request was rejected today, but the revelation of documents by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalist Partners, McClatchy and the Miami Herald, underscores the challenge the courts will face as his case proceeds. So, yeah, it was a mystery, right? His money. Tracing down his money was, and always is going to be a difficult proposition. Jeffrey Epstein wasn't fantastic at many things in life. He certainly was fantastic, though, at finding ways to stash money and hide money. And he did it perfectly. What do you think? Leon Black was just having him hold his money just because? Or Les Wexner was having him hold his money just because? Or Labette Johnson was just having him hold his money, because they're nice and they just wanted someone else to have their hands on it? Hell no, there was a reason Jeffrey Epstein was managing their money, and it wasn't because he was some sort of whiz. The man knew how to avoid taxes, the man knew how to hide money, and he certainly knew how to act like an absolute scumbag. The most extensive document, amounting to 500 pages detailing the activities of an Epstein offshore vehicle, comes from the Paradise Papers trove, millions of files leaked from the Bermuda-founded offshore services provider Appleby. Now remember, I was talking about the Paradise Papers and the Panama Papers and how all roads lead to Jeffrey Epstein when it comes to these financial crimes. And the fact that he had all of these shell companies, all of these places that were established in these tax havens, it just obviously adds up, right? Put it this way, there is plenty of circumstantial evidence, enough for probable cause to make an arrest, right? If you were a cop and you were putting this all together, certainly enough probable cause to bring somebody in. But yet Epstein was continuously let off the hook, and he was continuously provided cover to keep on doing what he was doing for decades. And it would not have taken much for these investigators to really go hard in the paint and to really step on the gas all the way back in 2007 and figure out all of this financial douchebaggery. But they were way too busy trying to cut their boy a sweetheart deal. The files reportedly show that by the mid-2000s, Epstein's firm had joined a roster of the world's wealthiest people and corporations in working with Appleby, and therefore gaining a skilled group of experts to help it navigate the secretive and low-tax world of offshore finance, the new report states. And we talked about Appleby last night when we were talking about the tax havens and what Appleby's role was. And of course, lo and behold, Epstein was involved with Appleby as well. Any lever of power, any sort of scummy financial situation, you can be sure of one thing. Jeffrey Epstein's name can be found somewhere in the documents. From at least 2000 to 2007, Epstein chaired a company registered in Bermuda called Liquid Funding Limited. This entity was partially owned by the investment bank Bear Stearns, where Epstein had worked, according to the report. The bank's collapse would help set in motion the 2008 financial crisis. Yeah, the too big to fail financial crisis, where none of these banksters went to prison, none of Jeffrey Epstein's best friends had to deal with consequences. Meanwhile, all of us had our 401ks wiped out, lost homes, people were on the brink, people were, really up against it. But the bankers, too big to fail, bro. Give them their TARP money, give them their bailout money, screw the rest of us. And when we do that and we bail these people out and we give these banksters favorable terms, remember, we're giving Jeffrey Epstein's key enablers, the top people who helped him facilitate all of this through the financial sector, well, we're giving them the good stuff. And those are the real people who are a problem, folks, in my opinion. These banksters, these people who work in the too big to fail world, and I don't mean the day-to-day workers, right? I never mean the frontline people. I'm talking about the bureaucrats, the bosses, the shitbirds. Epstein's offshore company was loaded up with some of the financial products, like mortgage-backed securities and collateralized loan obligations that would become synonymous with the financial excess leading to the financial crisis. Of course he was. He was locked into all of that stuff, mortgage-backed securities, collateralized loan obligations. That's basically, the way that these guys were running things, the way that they had things on lock, especially at Bears and Stearns. And then when the meltdown came, all of this stuff took a huge hit and they got clipped big time. According to the Miami Herald and McClatchy, liquid funding had commercial mortgages and investment-grade residential mortgages bundled into complex securities. And that's what they do as well, right? They'll bundle all of this stuff together and they'll put it in like these complex security arrangements. And then they'll go on with their financial douchebaggery like Epstein did. And it's just sickening to me that this guy and all of his friends are able to continue to do this. Still no regulations. And still no repercussions for any of these people. The three main credit rating agencies, Standard & Poor's, Fitch Ratings, and Moody Investor Service, all helped Bear Stearns create the securities in a way that would allow the creative product to get a gold-plated AAA rating, the Miami Herald and McClatchy reported. So The credit rating agencies, Standard & Poor's, Fitch, and Moody's, they're all in on the take as well, right? We can't trust any of them, just like Experian and the other actual, real, personal credit rating services. Who created that shit? Who came up with that idea? Certainly wasn't a poor person, I can promise you that much. The task of determining Epstein's wealth has been a significant factor in the decision of whether he is released for jail pending trial. Prosecutors cited Epstein's wealth as making him more likely to flee ahead of a trial date. And there's no doubt, Epstein was the kind of guy that had the ability to kick rocks and go if he wanted to. There's no doubt about it. He had the money, he had the means, he had the connections. So there was zero chance he was getting out of jail, just like Ghislaine Maxwell. And what made Ghislaine Maxwell even more of a flight risk, obviously, were her foreign passports. The Herald and McClatchy reporters were able to reach one director, Marcus Klug, listed in the leaked documents as helping administer Epstein's offshore vehicle. Klug, now a member of the governing board of Bundespension Schaas AG, a large Austrian pension fund, confirmed that he was a director of an Epstein company when he worked for an Austrian insurance company that had invested in liquid fund, according to the Herald and McClatchy. If it seems confusing, folks, that's the point. The whole entire point is for this shit to be confusing. They don't want anyone to know who owns these companies, who's administering these companies, who's running these companies, or who's funding these companies. So they use these shell situations in these tax havens, and then they make it real damn confusing for you. Liquid was evidently a shell company, and its directorship duties appeared pro forma. There was neither a physical board meeting or call between board members, Klug explained to the Herald and McClatchy, adding of Epstein, "I never even met him." So, right there is another article that talks about how Epstein was involved in these sorts of financial crimes that we see in the FinCEN files, we saw in the Paradise Papers, we saw in the Panama Papers, and we'll continue to see this moving forward when leaks like this occur. Because Jeffrey Epstein and people like Jeffrey Epstein, the other so-called elite, believe that they operate with a whole different set of rules than you and I. And the sad part is, for all of these years, that certainly has been the case. But from where I'm sitting and how I feel about things and how I think that most of you feel, I think that it's time that things change and that these people, they have to play by the same rules as everybody else. And if they get caught screwing around, I don't want to hear too big to fail. All I want to hear is how many years they're going to be serving in prison. If you'd like to contact me, you can do that at bobbycapucci@protonmail.com. That's BOBBYCAPUCCI at protonmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter at BOBBY_CAPUCCI. All of the links that go with this episode can be found in the description box. And to everybody who has donated to the podcast, thank you folks very much. As for me, I will be back later on, and we will pick up with the Daily Drop where we left off here. Hopefully there's something new to talk about, because it seems to be a pretty slow day. But that's okay, considering in the next couple of days, on the 3rd to be exact, we have the 11th Circuit Court and them picking up the case and hearing about the NPA. So we definitely have some serious news on the horizon. So the next couple of days, if the news is light, you can expect some flashback episodes as well as at least one new episode per day. But we'll see where we're at, right? Until then, folks, I hope you all have a fantastic day.
At Ease, we're all about calculating the best high for you. Ran out of shows to watch for the second time this week? Order an indica pre-roll. Social distance park hang? Pair that awkward picnic with a vaporizer. See, we're like your weed guy, but 420% nerdier. So just worry about when you're going to take that edible and let us do the rest. Ease, highly calculated cannabis delivery. Get 30% off your first order with promo code NERD at ease.com. That's EAZE.com.
Is eating fish healthy? Certainly not for the fish. Definitely not for the oceans. That's the reason the Sarno brothers, founding chefs at Good Catch Foods, began perfecting 100% plant-based seafood. Go to goodcatchfoods.com to learn more or shop online.